Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody who is viewing this course today. And welcome to Ace-Classes.com Incorporated presents Flakka, course number 20-497223. This course has previously been approved by the Florida Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, Mental Health Counseling, as well as the National Board for Certified Counselors, and the Florida Certification Board. In order to receive a certificate for observing this class for continuing education credits, you must pass the Flakka quiz with a minimum of 70% correct rate. Just to introduce myself, the talking voice that you hear today, my name is Paulina Forrest and I'm an attorney here in Broward County, Florida. Broward County has become famous in the local and national news lately because of the Flakka epidemic we are suffering from here. I'm an attorney and I'm licensed to practice here in the state of Florida by the Florida Bar. I am the founder and managing partner of a local law firm called East Broward Law. Although our law firm is based here in Florida, we actually lend our services statewide, and our attorneys have traveled and practiced in over 20 counties, predominantly in substance abuse and mental health work. We do focus on family law, adoption, dependency, probate, and as previously mentioned, mental health, substance abuse, specifically the Marchman Act and appeals. I've conducted trainings with Ace Classes and as an attorney previously, and you may have viewed some of our trainings for continuing education credits. Let's talk about Flakka, the newest designer drug. I know that many of you are not able to open a newspaper or a magazine without reading a headline or some other piece of information about Flakka. Our presentation today is entitled A Deadly Designer Drug. Let's get into why. Today we have some objectives that we'd like to meet. The first is to be introduced to this designer drug, commonly referred to as Flakka, but we'll go over some other names for it on the street and throughout medical professionals as well. It has a very unique position and development in the framework of controlled substances. We want to recognize the marketing techniques used by retailers and product manufacturers. We also want to learn about the target market. Additionally, we want to understand the development and evolution of the laws sought to control the production and possession of Flakka and why they're in trouble. Finally, we want to be aware of the reported effects and the dangers associated with the use of Flakka. We want to familiarize ourselves with the psychoactive ingredients often found in this designer drug. It's very complex, so we'll seek to understand why laboratories have difficulty detecting these synthetic compounds in potential users. Finally, we want to understand the metabolism and psychological effects of Flakka, and we'll explore some of the fact and fiction behind the media portrayal of Flakka. This is our table of contents slide. Because this presentation is available online, you can refer to it later for your reference if you want to reference a specific section or go back to a slide that we've previously discussed. Let's talk about designer drugs. What exactly is a designer drug? We wish it was as glamorous as perhaps the right-hand side of this slide is. However, drugs of abuse usually come from two different sources. We get drugs of abuse from plant products. These are naturally occurring drugs, the ones like cocaine, crack, marijuana, or heroin that's derived from opium, the poppy seed. And then we have pharmaceutical drugs as well. And these are derived drugs like LSD, methadone, bath salts, which is also very popular here in Florida for a while, Molly, which is like your LSD, and of course our newest rage, Flakka. So we've discussed a little bit about the organic drugs and we've just briefly touched on derived pharmaceuticals. So let's talk a little bit about the history. Our natural occurring drugs, of course, have been around much longer than our pharmaceuticals that have gone wrong. So let's discuss exactly when that happened and what we have now as a result. The production and manufacturing of drugs with psychoactive properties, for example, any amphetamine or barbiturate that you might see, for clinical use quickly diverted into an abusive problem. So, pharmaceutical companies would legitimately manufacture a drug whose main intent or side effect was some sort of hallucinogenic or psychoactive property, and quickly these drugs became abused by the population. Because of that, designer drugs are now a class of chemically manufactured drugs that are designed to simulate the effects of the naturally occurring drugs like heroin, cocaine, or marijuana, but they're manufactured in labs or clandestine labs in legal or illegal facilities throughout the world. Let's talk about one of the first designer drugs, one of the first pharmaceuticals gone wrong, and that is LSD. When abuse of these compounds reached unacceptable levels, their production, distribution were much more tightly controlled. So, one of our earliest examples, like we said, LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, was estimated that about 250,000 doses of LSD were distributed for just real clinical research purposes by a Sandoz pharmaceutical company. This occurred between the years of 1955 and 1965. The population that received the test doses spread the word very quickly that LSD was just a fantastic thing everybody should try, and recreational use quickly followed. Adverse publicity over the recreational use prompted this laboratory to restrict their samples severely, and the demand was still there. So, the first clandestine laboratories, these secret underground illicit labs, popped up to surface the new demand for LSD that was no longer available. So, today, new and totally synthetic drugs produced by these laboratories have become an increasingly important source of abused substances. Of particular concern, we have the fentanyl family, which is a family of very potent narcotic analgesics. The fentanyls are a large family of highly potent synthetic narcotics. They imitate all of the properties of opiates and opioids, but the real problem is they're chemically unrelated and therefore they don't cross react with any of the agents used in opioid screening tests. So, if you are at a drug treatment facility, you may already have a specialized test for this, but they are not generally available in screening facilities. So, if you do have a client who is abusing a fentanyl product, it will not pop up on the opioid screening for random UA or other type of drug screening test, depending on how many panels are available to you, which is very problematic. The people still suffer the same addiction for a widely available drug, and we can't test for it. Why are designer drugs like Flakka gaining so much popularity? It really seems like you cannot turn on the television or open a newspaper and magazine without being flooded by a headline that Flakka is being abused or that Flakka is the cause of a very serious tragedy. Let's talk about legal evasion. Originally, designer drugs attempted to stay ahead of drug laws. So, once the legislature would outlaw a certain chemical compound, the designer drug laboratories would slightly modify it to try to stay ahead of the curve of legalizing the drugs. They were producing it faster than the legislature could meet. Additionally, the affordability. Flakka is significantly cheaper than methamphetamine and cocaine. It makes it easier for more people to access it. Flakka is commonly called $5 insanity because that is approximately the cost for one hit that you would pay on the street. And finally, detection. Flakka is undetectable via conventional drug testing methods, the same issue that we just discussed with fentanyls. Drug courts that use general UA panels, either on-site or rapid test analyses, will not detect the presence of these synthetic derivatives in urine. It takes a long time to manufacture a test that is legally viable and accurate, and these drugs just occur too quickly. So what is Flakka? We know that it's a designer drug. Flakka can be snorted, it can be smoked, vaped, injected, or swallowed. It may also be combined with other softer drugs such as marijuana. The vaping of Flakka here brings me to an important point. One of the serious issues of Flakka is that the use of it can also be difficult to detect. You can walk through any mall nowadays and be very quickly accosted by somebody from a kiosk trying to sell you a vaporized cigarette pack. And Flakka can be manufactured to be smoked through a cigarette. So while it might look like somebody is performing a legal activity, it might in fact not be. Flakka is most typically made from a chemical alpha PVP. It's a synthetic version of an amphetamine-like stimulant, cathinone. And cathinone is a chemical derived from a plant that is grown in Middle East and Somalia. The plant is called khat, and the leaves, if they're chewed, will give off a euphoric buzz to the user. Some of you may have remembered seeing a movie recently called Captain Phillips. And in Captain Phillips, they featured a story of a boat that was overtaken by Somalian pirates who were chewing a green substance throughout the film. If anybody has seen it, that substance that they were eating was actually the khat plant. So Flakka is made as a derivative of that plant, a synthetic version of khat, but much more powerful. What does Flakka look like? This is a picture of it here on your screen. It looks like a crystalline substance. It looks a lot like rock candy. Sometimes people refer to it as that. It is made in labs primarily overseas, and it's sold to dealers in South Florida and elsewhere, really over the internet. The immediate and long-term effects of these synthetic cathinones like Flakka can rival some of the strongest crystal meth and cocaine highs. Let's talk about the funny name. We may have heard Flakka, Flakka, Wacka, Flakka Flame. Not many people know exactly where the term comes from. Not everybody is jumping up and down, getting ready to claim credit for this wonderful thing. But most likely, Flakka is a Hispanic colloquial word. It's derived from an expression meaning a beautiful, elegant woman who charms all that she meets because of its addictive properties. The drug name has also been associated with a very famous hip hop artist whose name is Wacka Flocka Flame, although he has discounted any association with it. Now, the street name, along with gravel and $5 insanity, is slang for the formula compound alpha pyrrolidopentophenone, a synthetic stimulant that's been abused recreationally for over a decade. And that gravel and $5 insanity name, you've seen the picture, it does look like it. And $5 insanity, we've previously discussed, that's referencing the very affordable price point. Let's talk about Dr. Jim Hall. He is an epidemiologist at the Center for Applied Research on Substance Use and Health Disparities at Nova Southeastern University, right here in Broward County, Florida. You've probably seen Dr. Hall on the TV lately, opining on the Flakka epidemic here in South Florida. He recently told CPS News that cathinones are the next, even more potent class of drugs to take over where MDMA leaves off. MDMA, known widely as Molly, has been the cause of a number of fatalities and the most recent round of overdoses, which hospitalized over a dozen people at Wesleyan University. Dr. Hall says that the drug is designed to cause the brain to flood with dopamine. It's a hormone that helps control the brain's reward and pleasure centers. Then, Flakka blocks the transmitters, producing an intense feeling of euphoria. Normally, when dopamine would be released, says Dr. Hall, even naturally or with other drugs, it gets reuptaked. It goes back to its original transmitting neurons. But in this case, its reuptake is blocked, so it remains there, making it particularly dangerous. Let's talk a little bit about the chemical compound of Flakka. This is exactly what a Flakka chemical compound reduced to its simplest form looks like. You see the phenyl, the pyrrolidinyl, and the pentanone. Flakka is a central nervous system stimulant. For my purposes, I'll refer to it as alpha PVP, and it was developed as a CNS stimulant compound in the 1960s. It is structurally related to pyrovalerone, a psychoactive drug that was used to treat chronic lethargy and fatigue. So already we know we're looking at a real upper. It has amphetamine-like effects, and this compound is part of a pyrrolidinophenone class of designer drugs which have appeared on the illicit drug markets in Germany and in other countries. It appears in the form of tablets or powders. Alpha PVP is widely sold on the internet as a research chemical, or a legal high, or sometimes you might hear it referred to as bath salts, probably for the intention of recreational drug use as a legal substitute for illicit compounds such as MDPV. Let's talk about how Flakka works. The mechanism of action is unknown for alpha PVP. Specifically, we have some beliefs that it acts similarly to the designer drug MDPV, which acts as a norepinephrine and dopamine reuptake inhibitor. That is exactly what Dr. Hall was mentioning on the previous slide. Pyrovalerone and its structural analogs include alpha PVP, and they're considered inhibitors of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine transporters. By stopping that reuptake, alpha PVP can enhance the effect of monoamines, which tend to have stimulating effects on the central nervous system. And these stimulating effects occur for a long period of time because there is no reuptake. So who's using Flakka? Why are we seeing it so often? Well, South Florida Crime Lab has a reported alpha PVP lab case program. And in 2012, they've tracked the data that we had about 2 reported cases of Flakka use. In 2013, that went up to 6. And in 2014, we had 576 reported cases of Flakka use in South Florida. These products are popular among very young people. The illicit drugs most used by high school seniors are marijuana, of course, is number 1, and number 2 are alpha PVPs. So these are very popular among young people, likely due to their availability and also their affordability. Talking about target markets. Captain Dana Swisher of the Fort Lauderdale Police Department recently told Rob Weil of FusionNet via email that the force had definitely noticed an increase in local usage, which we see in our statistics as well, but the usage is concentrated in low-income neighborhoods. And he quotes, "We have seen it predominantly in the low-income areas of the city, which are represented by several races and by both genders," he said. "This drug is not used by any specific race or gender, but its effects are quite dangerous to the user." Recent use of the drug has been reported primarily in Florida, but we have seen cases in Texas and Ohio. The drug is likely making its way into many other cities and is also currently gaining popularity in Europe. Let's look at another chart. Let's look at the use of synthetic cathinones in the United States compared to that of South Florida, compared to that of Florida. Let's begin with the largest numbers that we have, but you'll quickly see a trend. In the United States, there were total cases of 10,454. Florida comprised a third. 3,178 of those cases originated in my home state. South Florida, 1,076, which means a total of a third of all of the cases in the state of Florida originated here in South Florida. In South Florida, all on its own, accounts for about 10% of synthetic cathinone use nationwide. Out of a nation of 50 states, we are able to account for 10%. That is actually a staggering figure. Let's talk about baking Flakka, and I touched on this briefly before. Despite a concentrated government crackdown on bath salts and lab-concocted drugs of any kind, law enforcement officials and drug experts say that the supply and demand of new products is very much alive. They are examples of creative approach to e-cigarette smoking or vaping, what we just discussed, those vaporizing cigarettes that they can sell you legally, the latest craze in recreational inebriation. Our real concern, and this is a direct quote, is that this is going to be the main method of using new emerging synthetic drugs, whether in liquid form or solid form, says Dr. Hall. He authors an annual report on drug trends sweeping Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami-Dade counties. That's the South Florida area of synthetic cathinone use that we saw in the previous slide. More and more individuals are already and will be in the future continuing to use vaporizers to get high. Because vaporizers also have a legitimate legal use, you can imagine law enforcement's frustration in trying to determine if what's being inhaled is a legal or illicit substance. Let's talk about Flakka in the media. If you are viewing this presentation in around the summer of 2015 area, you'll have noted that we have had several news headlines, most of them making the front page and also national news about Flakka effects. Flakka in the media, is it worth the hype? Let's have some discussion about that. We're just another reefer madness. If you're familiar with the marijuana witch hunt from the 1930s, that previous slide showed a clip from the movie Reefer Madness, and it was an educational film created to educate people on the devastating effects of marijuana, which we assumed were true in the 1930s. And to explore the other side of the Flakka hype, a columnist by the name of Jacob Solom likens the Flakka media attention to kind of a trumped up witch hunt, just like we had in the 1930s to marijuana. Solom lists about 5 qualities of a drug story to tell you if it's just a lot of hype. He argues that Flakka stories arguably contain all 5, and he thinks that likens Flakka use to more of a hysteria and less of an epidemic. So let's talk about those 5 qualities, and then you can make the determination yourself if you think the Flakka media outbreak is well deserved or if it's just a lot of hype. The 5 qualities are: 1, that the media determines that it's an irresistible substance. Number 2, the media may portray that the drug will make you violent. Number 3, the media might say that it gives you superhuman strength. 4 is that it makes you crazy, and 5, just simply that it's the worst thing ever. Solom argues that all of these categories have been associated with Flakka, but could also be associated with really a bottle of vodka. People do all kinds of crazy and violent things when they're drunk, but we take that for granted, Solom tells the New York Times. We don't assume that the liquor made them do that. There's something about less familiar drugs that's almost magical in how they're described. Solom points out that drug scare tactics have been used as far back as 1914, when cocaine was thought to be a southern menace that gives users a resistance to the knockdown effects of fatal wounds. So whether you agree with Solom or whether you agree with other news media outlets, you can make the decision yourself as to whether or not you think the reputation of Flakka is well deserved or whether you think the reputation has been dramatized by the news. Let's talk about the actual documented behavioral effects of Flakka. This might help you make a determination of whether the drama is really there or not. These are actual documented behavioral effects put together by first responders in the South Florida area. They have noted an occurrence of panic attacks, anxiety, agitation, paranoia, hallucinations, psychosis, aggressive behavior, violence, self-destruction, self-mutilation, suicidal ideation, insomnia, anorexia, and depression. Let's talk a little bit about the physical changes that somebody using Flakka undergoes. Tachycardia, an increased heart rate, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, vasoconstriction, arrhythmias, hyperthermia. Let's talk about hyperthermia for a second. This is different than the hypothermia that we hear about a lot happening in states much colder than Florida. Hyperthermia is the exact opposite. It's an uncontrollable rise in body temperature. Rhabdomyolysis. Hopefully not many of you are familiar with rhabdomyolysis, but it is the process of melting muscle fiber. Mydriasis, muscle tremors. Additionally, physical effects like seizures have been observed, strokes, cerebral edemas, respiratory distress, cardiovascular collapse, myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, and finally death. Cathinone use can also cause rhabdomyolysis like we discussed on the previous slide. The melting of these muscle tissues and the release of the fibers into your bloodstream are filtered by the kidneys. This can lead to kidney failure and result in a user needing permanent dialysis. Taking additional Flakka while already high is a practice called snacking. It's a combination of using Flakka with other drugs, and it leads to very serious health complications. It includes rapid heart rate, agitation, extreme aggression, and psychosis. Once a user is using Flakka, they are more likely to use it again and again in a rapid time frame. We are starting to see a rash of cases of a syndrome referred to as excited delirium, said Hall. This is where the body goes into hyperthermia, generally a temperature of 105 degrees. The individual becomes psychotic. They often rip off their clothes and run into the street violently and have an adrenaline like strength, and police are called, and it takes 4 to 5 officers to restrain them. And then, once they are restrained, if they don't receive immediate medical attention, they can die. Let's look at some of the local headlines. Even since this presentation has been recorded and generated, there have been even more. Flakka frenzy leads to impalement by fence. This was a relatively recent occurrence. Here, of somebody under the influence of Flakka, you can see that individual on the right-hand side. On the left hand and bottom side of the screen, you see an individual who's actually attempting to break into a police station. Although highly unusual, this individual was under the influence of Flakka at the time, and he was experiencing a paranoid delusion that people were chasing him. So he ran to the local police station, which closed, and was attempting to break through the doors there. Let's talk about Flakka and the labs. The forensic world continues to struggle with the identifying synthetic drugs and their pharmacological and analytical chemistry characteristics. We've discussed this earlier throughout the presentation that synthetic drugs are created so rapidly that we also have to create tests in a rapid fashion in order to detect them. Proving scientifically that an unknown substance is actually Flakka is exceedingly difficult for forensic scientists. Flakka is manufactured internationally. Many samples are different than others, and although the original chemical compound might remain the same, the derivatives or additives to the drug make it very difficult to detect. If the government cannot prove the validity of a qualitative measurement beyond a reasonable doubt, then there can be no conviction, and law enforcement, the state attorneys or district attorneys, whoever your local or federal prosecutor's office might be, struggles with the fact that a court of law can only consider evidence that has been consistent and around for a long time to make sure that it's accurate. With synthetic drugs, it is a real struggle that when we manufacture these new random urinalysis or screenings, they haven't been around long enough to make a legal difference. In impaired driving prosecutions, if it can't be proven that the drug actually exists in a bloodstream because the analyst's opinion is too new or the test is too new, then there cannot be a conviction, frustrating not only laboratories but law enforcement agencies around the country. Let's talk about Flakka and the law. Section 812 of the Controlled Substances Act. This is 21 of the United States Code, Section 801, lists substances which were controlled in about 1970 when this law was enacted. Since its enactment in 1970, about 160 substances have been added, removed, or transferred from one schedule to another. The current official list of these controlled substances can be found in Section 1308 of the most recent issue of Title 21, Code of the Federal Regulations, Part 1300 to the end. On Friday, March 7, 2014, the DEA's Office of Diversion Control implemented the temporary placement of 10 synthetic cathinones onto Schedule 1 in order to combat manufacturing and use of Flakka and its derivatives. Let's take a moment to note the date. That's March 7, 2014, just about a year ago from when I'm recording this presentation. That is not a long time. Flakka has been around for a while, and we can see how big of an issue it is for law enforcement and the legislature to keep up with its manufacturing. Just a year ago, we were able to place it on Schedule 1. The action is based on a finding by the Deputy Administrator that the placement of these synthetic cathinones and their optical, positional, and geometric isomers, salts and salts of isomers, onto Schedule 1 of the CSA is necessary to avoid an imminent hazard to public safety. As a result of this order, the regulatory controls and administrative, civil, and criminal sanctions applicable to Schedule 1 controlled substances will now be imposed on persons who handle, manufacture, distribute, import, export, engage in research, conduct instructional activities, and possess or propose to handle any synthetic cathinones. So Flakka is illegal. Many people still are under the misimpression that Flakka has not yet been illegalized. It absolutely is illegal. It's a synthetic cathinone found on Schedule 1. Designer drugs are specifically made to fit around existing drug laws. And these drugs can either be in new forms of older illicit drugs, just adding a simple polymer chemical to a previously existing synthetic compound, or they can be completely new chemical formulas that are created to just fall outside of the law. The most common designer drugs are created by making a small derivative of an existing drug law's chemical structure. This variation allows the drug to have a very similar effect on the user as the previous illegal version, but the drug will not fall under the correct formula for many drug laws, avoiding arrest and also, of course, detection. Let's talk about fighting Flakka here in Broward County because of the wide epidemic that we have. This Community Flakka Action Plan was developed through a methodical process of assessment and strategy. The Broward County Sheriff's Office has implemented this action plan, and it is really quite detailed and helpful. The Commission facilitated a process to collect information on our community partners' available resources and ongoing and planned activities to address the rise of these synthetic drugs in Broward County. The results of the assessment were then analyzed to identify gaps in outreach programs to the community and to identify its needs. To create one unified plan, the Broward County Sheriff's Office created a calendar of outreach events to guide and inform activities in the community aimed to educate and prevent further harm from Flakka. This can be found on their website. The key community stakeholders include Broward Behavioral Health Coalition, the Broward Addiction Recovery Center, or BARC, the United Way Commission on Substance Abuse, the Broward Sheriff's Office, Fort Lauderdale Police Department, the Broward County School Board, Drug Court, Hospitals of Broward County, and the Broward County Medical Association. What do you do if you encounter Flakka or you suspect somebody you know is using Flakka? In an emergency, of course, always dial 911. If you would like further information on substance abuse and mental health treatment options, please dial 211. To schedule a presentation or a training, or to get more information from the Broward County Sheriff's Office Flakka Initiative, again, dial 211. For informational and educational resources, please visit www.211broward.org or www.drugfreebroward.org/facingflakka. If you would like to anonymously report a dealer, call 954-493-8477 or 954-493-TIPS. Let's take a moment to discuss the Marchman Act. Some of you listening to this presentation may know a little bit about the Act already, or you may know its parent legislation, the Baker Act. This area of law is different from the Baker Act and was enacted in about 1993. It's entitled the Hal S. Marchman Alcohol and Other Drug Services Act, and it provides for the involuntary or voluntary assessment, stabilization, and treatment of a person allegedly abusing substances like drugs, alcohol, or, of course, Flakka. A petition for involuntary assessment can be filed whenever there is a good faith reason to believe that an individual is substance abuse impaired, and because of that impairment, they have lost the power of self-control with respect to substance use. A petition for involuntary treatment may be filed once the written assessment is reviewed by the court and the recommendation is involuntary treatment. I can take a moment to tell you a little bit about my personal experience in litigating the Marchman Act on both sides. The Marchman Act is a civil proceeding. It is not a proceeding brought before a criminal court. A Marchman Act is almost akin to a civil lawsuit, where one person determines that another person is greatly suffering from substance abuse. I have litigated the Marchman Act from both the petitioner's and the respondent's point of view. And one thing that I can tell everybody is that the process is one that requires commitment from both sides. A family member of an addict plays just as important of a role as the addict does in their own treatment. And prior to initiating a Marchman Act, it is a very good idea to consult an attorney who is experienced in bringing these actions that help you find a treatment facility, that can help you discuss your loved one's needs, and that can assist you in gaining the right court intervention that you need. The Marchman Act is several steps and requires the coordination of law enforcement agencies, substance abuse facilities, addicts, and families, so please be advised to contact someone with experience in this area. Let's go to a couple of questions now on our next slides. Throughout this presentation, we've given you some information. These questions are just for fun and for your own educational purposes. Because you have no way to submit your answers to me, I wouldn't even know if you're wrong. So let's go forward and do them together. Question number 1. Which is an example of a diverted pharmaceutical? So this is not our organically derived drug. This is a diverted pharmaceutical. Is it A, marijuana, B, cocaine, C, LSD, or D, crack? We'll give you just a second to think about your answer. You are correct if you chose the answer C, LSD. Remember that laboratory that we previously discussed? It was kind of our pioneer-derived pharmaceutical drug, the one where all the testing just went a little too well in the control groups who quickly told all of their friends about the effects of the LSD drug, launching our first pop-up of synthetic laboratories. Let's go to question number 2. Which of the following locations are exponentially affected by Flakka use? And if you recall throughout our presentation, we referenced a couple of charts that isolated use in a few regions throughout the United States. Is it A, Sweden, B, South America? Is it C, South Florida, or D, Texas? I'll give you a few seconds to think about your answer. If you chose C, South Florida, you are correct. Here you can see a picture of our beautiful Las Olas Isles, not an area that has been immune to the effects of Flakka. Remember that South Florida accounts for 10% of all of the cases of Flakka nationwide and a third of all of the cases in the entire state of Florida. Let's go to question number 3. What is the most dangerous thing about Flakka? Is it A, hyperthermia, which is the rapid rise of body temperature, as Dr. Hall previously stated, up to 105 degrees? B, excited delirium? C, rhabdomyolysis, remember the melting of the muscle fibers that has to be filtered through the kidneys? D, psychosis? Or E, all of the above? Again, a few moments to think about your answer. If you chose E, you are correct. Well, that said, if you chose any of them, you're partially correct. 16 people have died from using Flakka in Broward County since September of 2014. Again, this presentation is being recorded in the month of August 2015. So you can see within a year's period of time, that number is probably even greater. Let's talk about question number 4. What is another slang name for Flakka? Is it A, bath salts, B, molly, C, wild card, or D, gravel? When you consider your answer, I'll encourage you to remember the appearance of Flakka, what it actually looks like. I'll give you a hint. You've seen it before as a photograph on this slide. I'll give you another hint. You're about to see it again. If you chose D, gravel, you are correct. Flakka comes in little crystal pebbles. It's often called gravel by dealers for this reason. People say that it resembles the type of gravel that you may buy at a pet store to fill the bottom of your fish tank. If you chose wild card, you are incorrect. That is a name that I made up. and hopefully does not catch on. Let's talk about question number 5. Flakka is derived from which chemical compound? Is it A, alpha PVP, B, MDPV, C, THC, or D, beta RSD? I'll give you a few moments to think about your answer. This one is a toughie. You may have to go back and reference the slides with the actual photographs of the chemical compounds. If you chose A, alpha PVP, you are correct. Here we can see alpha PVP and how similar it actually looks to MDPV. You can see we're just missing that one link on the left-hand side, the double O link. And if you chose the beta RSD, I'm sorry you fell for another one of my fake choices, which hopefully, again, doesn't catch on. Let's address question number 6. Flakka attempts to simulate the euphoric buzz obtained from chewing the leaves of this naturally occurring cathinone-producing plant. And I'll give you a hint. Throughout the presentation, I referenced a movie. The movie was called Captain Phillips. So try to remember which plant Flakka is attempting to emulate in its production. I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer. If you guessed cot, you are correct. Again, featured in the movie Captain Phillips, cot originates from Somalia and the Middle East. It's chewed, and you might have seen it chewed by the pirates in this video of Captain Phillips. It's chewed to obtain that euphoric-like buzz. Let's look at question number 7. Rhabdomyolysis, a possible health consequence of Flakka, is A, recurrent severe migraines, B, memory loss, C, a melting of the muscle tissue and the release of muscle fibers into the bloodstream. This can lead to kidney failure and result in a user needing permanent dialysis. Or D, is it hallucination? I'll give you a moment to consider your answer. And again, as a hint, throughout the presentation, we've referenced this consequence and there may have been a photograph associated with it. If you answered C, rhabdomyolysis, you are correct. Again, remember, the melting of the muscle tissue into the bloodstream is a very serious occurrence. A human's kidneys cannot facilitate that filtration, ultimately ending up in the person needing dialysis. Let's look at question number 8. When did the DEA place 10 synthetic cathinones into Schedule 1 in order to combat manufacturing and use of Flakka and its derivatives? Is it A, 2014, B, 2007, C, 2009, or D, 2010? I'll give you a few moments to consider your answer, but remember, I was relatively shocked at how recent it was. Hint, hint. If you answered A, 2014, you are correct. Remember, I think the exact date was March 7th of 2014, just a little over a year ago. It was the placement of synthetic cathinones into Schedule 1. It was a very recent development. Down here on Table 1, you can see factors that must be considered by the DEA before a drug can be scheduled. You'll take a note if you read through these at your leisure that Flakka meets all of these criteria. Let's look at question number 9. How exactly can Flakka be consumed? A, via inhalation or smoking. B, it can be vaporized. C, it can be injected. D, it can be eaten. Or E, all of the above. Again, we touched on this in our presentation in a couple of different areas. It is one of the reasons that Flakka is so prominent and one of the reasons it's so dangerous and hard to detect. I'll give you a few moments for you to consider your answer. If you answered E, all of the above, you are correct. Remember that Flakka can be smoked, ingested, snorted, and vaporized. We've previously discussed some issues in the slides about how dangerous vaporization of Flakka actually is. It's so difficult for police to detect whether the person is vaporizing a legal substance or an illicit substance. No matter how Flakka is used, it still brings on all of the following: hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, insomnia, psychosis, and death. No matter the manner of ingesting Flakka, the effects are the same. Let's look at question number 10. See if you can identify the real Flakka headline. Is it A, cops, naked man high on Flakka ran through traffic to escape imaginary killers? Is it B, Florida man high on Flakka attacked officer, said he was God, had sex with a tree, police say? Is it C, exclusive, man on Flakka impaled while trying to climb fence? Is it D, man fueled by Flakka tries to kick in door at police headquarters? Is it E, all of the above? While you consider your answer, you may want to refer to some of the slides before in the presentation. I think I provided some photographs and likely even a headline or two that might give you a clue as to what the correct answer to question number 10 is. I'll give you a few moments to consider.
If you chose E, you are correct. It is all of the above. Now, in the next few slides, you will find all the references that we used in this presentation, and I wanted to highlight one that I find to be extremely valuable. That is the Marchman Act User Reference Guide from 2003. It's produced by the State of Florida Department of Children and Families and Substance Abuse Program. And within that handbook, you'll learn about the Marchman Act, the general provisions of it. You'll learn about clients' rights, as well as the difference between voluntary admission procedures and involuntary admission procedures, protective custody, emergency admissions, alternative and voluntary assessment for minors, court-involved admissions. Those are civil in nature, as we mentioned earlier. And within those court-involved admissions, you'll learn more about involuntary assessment and stabilization, involuntary treatment, as well as petitions for an extension of the involuntary treatment. It also touches upon local ordinances, prohibition and authorization, admission procedures, offender referrals, and inmate substance abuse programs. Within that Marchman Act reference guide, you'll see what a petition for involuntary assessment and stabilization looks like, as well as a petition for involuntary treatment and petitions for extension or renewal of the involuntary treatment. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us at email address info@Ace-Classes.com.